Alas, all good things must come to their end, and in 1949, Stree and Smith finally cancelled Doc Savage, and pretty much ended their time in the pulp business, as by then, comics and other media had firmly taken their hold. And it would seem that pulp heroes were just another fad. They had served their purpose and now made way for the new generation. And throughout the 50s, there would not be much activity for the good doctor, except for one event that sadly would be one of the most tragic in the character's entire history. Lester Dent, or as he was known to the many readers, Kenneth Robeson, passed away in 1959. And it becomes even sadder when you consider that the character's revival would only follow a few years later. For when the swinging 60s hit, Doc Savage was reborn thanks to reprints of the original pulp stories by Bantam Books, which ran throughout the 60s up until the 90s, although they're more famously referred to as the Bama books, given the beautiful artwork on the covers by renowned artist James Bama, who in many ways created the iconic Doc Savage, complete with the shaved widow's peak haircut and torn shirt. This new Doc Savage design was based on the actor and model Steve Holland, who had actually played another classic hero, Flash Gordon, in a TV series back in the early 50s. In addition to reprinting all the classic stories, the series would also reprint some lost ones, most famously The Red Spider, which was a novel that Lester Dent himself had actually written way back in April of 1948 and was about the Cold War, but the story was axed by a new editor, though thankfully the manuscript was rediscovered in 1975 by Will Murray himself, a prominent figure in Doc Savage's history, a writer and historian of the character, who found it amidst Dent's papers, and finally saw print in July of 1979. In addition, around that time, Philip Jose Farmer, another writer, wrote the book Doc Savage, His Apocalyptic Life, which essentially took the stance that Doc was actually a real person and that Dent's novels were merely chronicles of his real-life adventures. And speaking of revivals, Doc would also make a return to comics, though at first briefly in 1966 with a one-issue adaptation of the novel The Thousand-Headed Man, which was actually meant to be a tie-in to an upcoming movie. But we'll get to the films in a bit. Then, in 1972, Marvel, who had enjoyed tremendous success with characters like X-Men and Spider-Man, among many, many others, took a stab at the character, beginning with 8 issues, which were in turn themselves adaptations of the stories The Man of Bronze, the very first story, Brand of the Werewolf, Death in Silver, which was sort of a sequel to Man of Bronze, and The Monsters, and would even release one massive adaptation of the movie from 1975, as well as some black and white magazines to tie into it. The series was handled by Doug Moench, John Buscema, and Tony DeZuniga. And to top it all off, Doc even teamed up with The Thing in one of Marvel's series, 2-in-1, issue 29, which in and of itself would be an important issue that would form the basis of later storylines in the Marvel Universe, such as the Project Pegasus saga and Squadron Supreme Death of a Universe. But getting back to the movies, as I said, Gold Key published a comic to tie in with an upcoming film. However, this wasn't the famous 75 film. This was a film that was going to star Chuck Connors way back in the mid-60s. However, this project never saw the light of day, due to issues with the rights. However, in 1975, not long after the success of the reprints and the Marvel comics, legendary producer and special effects pioneer George Pal finally got The Man of Bronze his own movie, which starred Ron Ely as the character and was directed by veteran Michael Anderson, who you might know as the director of Around the World in 80 Days and Logan's Run. The film, which was based off of the very first Doc Savage story, was anything but smooth sailing, as changes within Warner Brothers forced even the respected veteran Powell to cut costs during production, which is one of the reasons cited for the subpar effects, which is shocking given Powell's status as a pioneer of the medium. Not to mention, the film also took cues from the Batman 60s TV series with its self-aware camp style, especially evident with the extremely over-the-top and cheesy theme song.
He's noble and strong. He's got a brain, a super brain that will not rest. He'll right every wrong. Let us all try and help to soothe the savage breast.
As well as a bunch of little things, such as one of the villains sleeping in a giant crib. I am not making that up, I swear. And even giving Doc a glint in his eye, almost akin to the teeth sparkle that you so often see in commercials. With all of these elements in mind, it's little wonder that the film was a critical and commercial disaster, not helped by the fact that the same summer it was released was also when Steven Spielberg's masterpiece Jaws was also released and completely swept the box office, ushering in a new generation of summer blockbusters. And speaking of Spielberg, later when the film was re-released on VHS, the cover of the box was actually meant to resemble more Indiana Jones due to the popularity of the series, and to hopefully get away from the camp image a little bit. However, what's even more interesting than the film itself is what its failure ultimately led to the cancellation of, which was a sequel. Right at the very end of Man of Bronze, there was an announcement at the end that there would be a sequel called The Archenemy of Evil, which in turn, according to rumors and a leaked script, would have been based on the 1934 story and sequel to Man of Bronze, Death in Silver, as well as taking cues from the 1937 story The Feather Octopus, with its villain having a man-eating octopus as a pet. But even more interesting than that is the fact that this was actually meant to be the first movie, but Powell wasn't confident in it and felt that the general audience needed an origin story. And apparently, Enemy of Evil, or part of it, was also being filmed simultaneously during principal photography for Man of Bronze, but as mentioned before, the lackluster reception meant that the project was killed. Then finally, in the hopes of getting a Dog Savage TV series made, Powell commissioned a 2-part script by Alvin Sapinsley based on the 1935 story The Secret in the Sky. And while the script was completed by January of 1975, the failure of the film meant that this never got greenlit. And with that, we come to the end of the second part. Join me for the third and final part, where we will discuss what happened to Doc in the 80s, 90s, and where his present standing is today. See you then.